I'll tell you a little bit about myself before I start speaking. I spent 10 years practicing labor and employment law in Boston. I'm the second speaker here, I think, from Boston. And then I moved to the UK, where I studied organizational leadership and coaching. And immediately, I started getting calls and requests for people inviting me to come in and help them to figure out how to manage this millennial workforce. They just said they're exhausting, they want so much, we can't deal with them. How do we learn to lead them? How do we teach them to be followers? So when I started doing this work about 10 years ago, that's what I went out to do. Well, let's fast forward to where we are today, and where we are today is Facebook, Airbnb, Tumblr, Lyft, Eventbrite, I could go on, Instagram, Dropbox, Pinterest, I'll stop. They're all run by millennials. And when I say millennials or Gen Y, I'm talking about those born after 1980. And BNP Paribas just put out a study of the 2,600 ultra-high net worth entrepreneurs. And guess what? More millennials than any other generation. And they have a higher head count, and they have greater profit ambitions. And this is the generation, BNP Paribas is calling it the rise of the Milleniumpreneur. So when I started thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about, I thought, you know, all this stuff that I used to try to get us to understand about the millennials, it's what we need to look at to figure out how we can lead organizations through times of innovation and disruption. Gone are the days where you come in and you say, let's do this. Let's create a team. Let's put some structures in place. Let's plan for what we're going to do. Let's have a big strategy conference, and we'll come back together, in 2 weeks' time and figure out what we're going to do. Those days are over, and this generation comes in, and what they say is, we want to lead. We want to lead now. And what we used to say to them was, well, you have to wait. You got to pay your dues. You got to learn about how things work around here first. That doesn't work anymore. If you want to lead an innovative workforce, a disruptive workforce, you have to be the one in any leadership role that empowers others to be in a leadership role. And in fact, what Deloitte found in a recent study is that 1 in 4 millennials are leaving within a year of taking a job because they're not getting leadership opportunities. So we start with Google, of course, when we're at a disruption conference. We start with Google. This comes from the book, How Google Works. And what happened one day at Google is on a Friday night, Larry Page put in a search, and the ads that came up on the other side of the bar had nothing to do with what the person was searching for. So did he, on a Friday night, assemble a team, put someone in charge of the team, give them some instructions about what they're supposed to do, figure out whose job it was to figure out how to recode this thing? No, that's not what he did. On a Friday night, he took the ads, he taped them up to a bulletin board, and he wrote, "These ads suck." And on Monday morning when he came to work, it was fixed. 5 people for whom it wasn't their job to figure this out, who didn't have that as their remit, felt like this was an opportunity for them. It's what interested them. They thought it was ingenious. They thought it would, something to figure out. And it was fixed. So rule number 1 that comes from the millennials, be a chief enabler, be a chief empowerment officer. When I go in to do these workshops with millennials, I say, what do you think about leadership? We just talked about that. They want distributed leadership. They want to be able to lead from any chair. What do you think about hierarchy? We hate it. We hate it. And hierarchy is the enemy of innovation. It just doesn't move fast enough. So inside of your organizations, you've got to learn how to break down silos, and you've got to learn how to empower people and give them space to collaborate on whatever it is that they want to work on. A good example of a company that does this well is Gore-Tex. And when Bill Gore started Gore-Tex, he wanted to start a humanistic organization. He wanted to start an organization where there were no job titles, where everyone was considered an associate, and in fact, when you were hired, you weren't even given a role. So that means you have to hire really good talent, right? You have to hire people who can figure it out. And you have to hire people that can figure out what their strengths are, what they do well, what gives them energy, what they enjoy doing so much that work doesn't feel like work. And then they have to be able to move through the organization and figure out where to devote those skills and where to put those talents and passions. And people who work for Gore-Tex will say it takes a while. It takes 12 to 18 months to figure out where you're going. But then you figure out what you want to do, and you start leading on something. Call a meeting, get some people to show up. When the current CEO was recently interviewed by Gary Hamel, who wrote the book What Matters Now, he said, well, so if you call a meeting, but no one has to show up because you're not a leader, then what do you do if no one shows up? She says, well, then you're not a leader. Generation Y wants to know why. Everything's why. Why do we do this? And why do we do this? And why do we do that? Well, that's exhausting. I've got so much else to do. I've got to figure out what, and how. But that's not the way to figure out innovation. You have to connect with your core purpose. And Jim Collins has been writing about this for ages in his book, Built to Last, and his book, Good to Great. He talks about those organizations which have withstood the test of time have done so because they know what their purpose is. Amazon, why do they do what they do? They're obsessed with their customer. Right? So what did they do? Well, Jeff Bezos loves books, so he wanted to be the biggest online bookseller, so he started doing books, and then he thought, but the customer's obsessed with getting that book fast. How can we get it faster? Let's create Kindle. So people still buy books, but they buy less books, because now they're buying the Kindle editions of things. And then he said, what else could we get them as fast as they want it, right? And then you get Amazon Prime, and they're now the world's biggest seller of everything, the ambition. But it's still about why, customer obsession. And the organizations that withstand the test of time and the organizations that can innovate really get this. And then the last one is whoever tries the most stuff wins. And that's a quote from Tom Peters, who's a management consultant. And why this reminded me of Gen Y is that what I often hear about them is this generation wants breadth. We need depth. We need subject matter expertise. They want to be seconded to this place, and they want to have this opportunity, and they want to try marketing, and tomorrow they want to try R&D, and then they want to try sales. They don't know what they want. And what this is talking about is they've got it right. They've got it right. You've got to try as many things as you can, and you have to create a culture where failure isn't frowned upon, a culture where, you hear that fail fast, fail often, but you share those failures openly and honestly. Harvard Business Review, I think yearly now it feels like, but they're always putting out a magazine on, the best failures, the greatest failures. How is it that we can help people to feel like they have the space to try things and to really go with that and see what happens? When I think about innovation, what I most think about is that inertia is the enemy of innovation. And so for those of us who are stuck in the old paradigm and who feel like, well, we're doing something, it's working, we're doing it well, let's just keep doing it, that's when you miss it. That's when you miss it. And when you look at an organization like Netflix, for an example, right, they were making loads of money. And when Reed Hastings decided in 2011, I think it was, to start online streaming, the stock plummeted 76%. But he decided not to stay with his old model, right? But he knew there was a new delivery system coming and tried something different. So you cannot get stuck in inertia and stuck in what's working.
And so you also say you have to make time for Generation Y, because they're the ones who actually grew up in a time where the digital thinking is just the way you think. And you mentioned Gore-Tex and Google. Do people, business people, do they need to start thinking about adding some of these millenniumpreneurs to the executive level?
I'm all for that, but I also think it's just about adding people to your executive team that understand those things. So what I think is interesting about the millenniumpreneur, or just millennials in general, one thing I think is really interesting about them is that they really understand things from the consumer's view. They put the customer experience at the heart of everything. And if you really want to be innovative, you always have to be thinking about your customers. How are they annoyed? How are they delighted? And Generation Y does that so well, A, because they're the biggest demographic in the world right now, but B, and they just, compared to Gen X, which is before them, and Gen Z, which is after them, they actually have spent more money, and they've been more kind of consummate consumers, if you like. So you have to understand consumer behavior. 2, you have to be willing to challenge the status quo and challenge the leaders. I mentioned Jeff Bezos from Amazon, but he'll fire you if you're on his board and he doesn't feel like you're challenging him. And that generation, like they just grew up naturally sort of being permitted to challenge their kind of teachers and their parents and people who are older than them, so they do that well. And I think you just have to, like, we talk so much about disruption and technology, but at the end of the day, organizations are humans. You know, they're comprised of human beings, so deeply, deeply understanding kind of human behavior will go a long way.
Just before we end our conversation, it's just like your opinion on, it's not just in the in the business landscape that we see disruption, also in the political landscape. We've had a Brexit, we have an election campaign, a president campaign in the US, which calls for a disruption we haven't seen before. What does that say about the current times when it comes to political leadership, in your opinion?
Well, I'm one of the few people that voted in both. I'm a dual citizen.
Yes, yeah.
So I voted in Brexit, and I've already voted in America. And
who did you vote for?
I hope that I do better in the U.S. election than I did in the Brexit election. Just say that.
Okay, that's a good answer.
What I think... What I think about why this is happening is that the beautiful thing about privilege is that we don't know we have it, you know? And what's happening in this disruptive world is that we're now creating opportunities for lots of other people. And people feel challenged by that. You know, immigration is about opportunities for other people and creating places for them. And the problems with, you know, where can we get labor cheaper or products, you know, all of these things that Brexit and Trump sort of argue for or argue against. And if you listen to their campaign slogans, right, it's like regain control. It's like take back America, make America great again. You know, we need control. Well, you know, to me, that's backward looking, you know. To me, that's about saying, like, oh, let's just wind it back, you know. And actually, in Brexit, more people that voted for Brexit were of a different generation than the one that I've been speaking about. And you just can't do that. And I think when I try to have, like, the most sympathy for people who are voting that way, I think what I kind of get to is, you know, when you've really had this privilege, then equality starts to feel like oppression to you, and it's painful to feel like your place in the world is being threatened. And so this is one way to get it back, but I think a better way to get it back is just keep innovating and see what happens.